Hi, my name is Adam Houle. This is the poet Mason Yarborough. We're on the campus of Francis Marion University in Florence, South Carolina, and we're going to talk about my poem that was recently published in Superstition Review called A Time to Tear and a Time to Mend. So I'll just start by reading it. A time to tear and a time to mend. Across the lawn the fungi bloat. The gray-wish days have come. Summer's gone. Wreck it, this failing, moss-haired bench, its gaminess of pine and rot. By inchworm increments, every edge turns soft. Lapse into the season already. Excuse me. Into sadness and apathy, marigolds. Lean your heads and seed. Old light dribbles off the arc lamp in fog that seems to drift as it shines. The mind's an anchored thing. What does it mean when they say dew point? Declaim it. Does air take on water like a boat foundering on a slow and graceful sink? Or, as I suspect, does it leach like cellar walls I watched as a kid? I only saw what I could see. Mary, the cloaked mother, or a candle mid-collapse. Bulbed clouds, ephemeral head, I stomped to pulp the caps.
Very good reading.
Thank you.
Very good. So, I do have a couple of questions, but I like to do top down. So, your title, A Time to Tear and a Time to Mend. How did you come up with that for this specific piece?
Sure. Well, the quote's from Ecclesiastes, and a time to sow, a time to rent, a time, and the inspiration for the poem was the sort of transition of seasons, and the way in which, this changes from summer to fall, fall to winter, sort of carry a sadness or a weight for me at least.
Yeah.
And so that's where that came from.
Okay, so my first question is, you give us almost three distinct images here. So we have this idea of the gaminess of a bench, and then another image of dew point and what that is, and then as we get down, we get the cellar and then Mary. How did you come up with? How did you cohesively connect those three different images? What was the inspiration behind those specific ones?
Mm-hmm. Trial and error. The inspiration for the poem originally was the bench in my backyard. We had this bench that had been there for years before I bought the house, and it was all soft at the edges and moldering and mossy. And there was something about a really early morning. I remember it was probably around 5 in the morning, and it was one of those cool, really damp mornings.
Mm-hmm.
And the way the light was just filled with water from the street light.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, and
I'm
so
starting to see it.
Yeah,
okay.
And it made me think of when I was a kid, the basement at my parents' house, his concrete walls, all that water would leach through in the really humid weather. And so a lot of trial and error. I don't remember exactly how I came into the ordering of it, but it was those three sort of constellations of ideas moving around.
Yeah. So I remember one time we were talking before, and you would tell us how a poem could start years ago and not be finished until years later. So the way you just said, remembering the cellar walls from your childhood, and then the gaminess of the bench from a house that you bought, that's a big gap.
Yeah.
So is this one of those poems that just kind of over the years you put together?
Well, I think it probably was, it probably started in its way back in my parents' basement, right? When I was
Right.
a little
Yeah.
kid, yeah.
Okay.
And that sort of maybe like opened the poem, if that
Right.
makes
Yeah.
sense. And it took, 30 some years until it finished itself. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think so. And I didn't know that, I'll say I didn't know how important that image on that wall was, right? Until
Yeah.
30 some years later, sitting on that rotting bench. Yeah.
So with organization,
Hmm.
you go from like, you know, current to past. Why didn't you start the other way? Tell us about the cellar wall and then how it
Yeah.
went the other way. Was that just like that's just how it happened? Was that a decision? Was there like
Hmm.
did you
Hmm.
actually during your revision process move parts of it around to see how it would sound different? Like what was your
Yeah.
writing process and revision for this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know I started with the bulbed clouds.
Okay.
That was the opening thing because my yard, the yard had a bunch of these bulbous sort of mushrooms coming up in that autumny,
Mm-hmm.
damp time, um, and I don't know exactly how they kept getting bumped down. But somewhere
Okay.
along the line, I realized, oh, I want to close with that. That felt more effective to me. Yeah, that's a really good question. Why not start in the past and then work on my way forward? It felt right this way.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
And I do have to say, the way you ended it, rhyming mid collapse with
Hmm.
caps in your last two lines, that was like the perfect like punch.
Thank you.
Like you really got that. When I read that part, it really got me because you just rhymed collapse with caps, and the two images that the rhymes have are so completely different because we're talking about Mary the cloaked mother or a candle mid collapse and then bulb clouds of a moral head. I stomp to pulp the caps. Like those are two very different images that
Hmm.
you connected with a rhyme, and it was so effective.
Hmm.
I was like, whoa! Like, how did he do this? Like,
Luck. Um,
look,
luck. I knew. Yeah, I mean that's really beautiful, and I'm glad that rhyme's doing what I was really happy with it as well. I thought it sounded good, right? I was like, oh yeah, it kind of had a nice, and all the P's there, right? Those feels damp. It feels mucky,
right?
murky, But I knew I needed to come back. I wanted to come back to the moment, right? To the
To the
adult, right?
yep,
And so it's
okay,
almost as if this speaker's sort of reflecting on their childhood, and then almost like, I mean, it's a very violent image as well.
right.
I think.
Yeah, you bring
Yeah.
us. It's like you take us through this like transcendence of thought from like
Hmm.
childhood thought, adult thought, and then even with like the dew point part where you're like declaim it and then you like make up your these definitions for it. Like what
Mm-hmm.
is dew point? Like how does it work?
Hmm.
Does the air take on water like a boat, or does it leach like cellar walls? Like
Hmm.
that's as a kid when we're asked questions about things that happen, like the wind or something. We come up with these
Hmm.
fantastical like ideas of what that is, and so it's like you keep bringing us back and forth,
Hmm.
and then finally your first line across the lawn the fungi bloat, I stomp to pulp the caps, the last line,
Mm-hmm.
it literally like just connects it all like linearly because we're ending on fungi, but then we're just ending on mushrooms, which are fungi again.
Mm-hmm.
Like so you connected it all that way and it was just so well done.
Thank you.
Like it made it linear even though the thoughts were not.
Yeah.
Like we're jumping from a childhood thought to an adult thought to like when the speaker was a kid, but then you connect it all together with this idea of the mushrooms in your
Yeah.
yard, and like
Hmm.
I just thought that was like just awesome how you did that. And so like would you say that was luck again or was that
Hmm.
something that you had to think about?
Um, a little bit of both, maybe. It felt that closure felt good.
Okay.
It felt accurate. It felt if I'm going to open with this sort of like bloating imagery, right? These little mushrooms, sort of almost like in time lapse, right?
Yep.
That they're bloating. That something has to happen to them, and I also felt like it's sort of like. I mean, it's a little fantastical, right? And that idea of like trying to define dew point. Like, what does it
Right.
mean? Is it a boat sort of floundering, or is it like this leaching process? I mean, it's sort of imaginative, and then that speaker's turn toward sort of almost a private images of the candle or Mary, right? This idea of sort of the religious significance there. It felt like I needed to come back, or that the poem wanted to sort of offer some sort of closure out of the mind of the speaker.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you really, that's how I felt, because
Mm.
it was like the speaker gave us this little tidbit of like what's going on inside, especially because you say earlier, the mind's an anchored thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so thinking of the mind as an anchored thing, and then you have the boat and the fog, and then we get down here to this flighty kid memory.
Yeah.
But if you think about the mind as an anchored thing, like it makes sense. Like anchors go way down deep, and so of course, like when you pull it up, something might come up, and it seems like Mary, the cloaked mother, or candle mid collapse, was the thing that the anchor with the mind got brought up when talking about these two different the fungi on the two different levels.
Yeah.
It's like a really interesting idea. It seems like the whole poem worked together in a way to make all the images concrete and connected. But like on my first reading of it, I didn't get it. I was like, it was good. Like I liked the way some of the rhymes that you had. I loved how you were like disclaim it, just like all by itself, just right there, and it was just like a stop. It was like disclaim it. I was like, ooh, what's he about to do next? You know, and then I read it again and a couple other times, and it was just like, whoa, like this poem like it has nuances that you really have to figure out. And so, do you think that is luck as well, or did you during revision really try to put that together?
Well, I like the boat imagery, and right. I mean, that idea of a boat sort of floundering or something like that, and then anchored felt accurate, right? That the mind sort of locates us, right? Like it has weight. It carries, right? It carries us in some ways, or it sort of also holds us back. So I think in that way, it's a following the sound, following the logic of the poem.
Okay.
Right? As opposed to thinking like I have a philosophical point I want to make. Not so much, as much as a sort of like is that an accurate sort of intellectual emotional statement, right? That the mind is an anchored thing. Yeah, I think so. I think for me, it feels accurate. And so then sort of following that through.
Yeah, and I love how you did that, because it just like, you think of fog and anchored, and then you bring up the boat, and then like you have the fungi at the beginning, and then the gaminess of pine and rot. So we know that like, and then inchworm increments. My favorite. that was good too, because like even then there's like this time lapse already starting.
Right.
Because a bench doesn't rot in a day.
Right. I mean, not even in South Carolina.
Right, not yet.
Yeah.
Anyways, we're getting there. But that's something that happens slowly, and it kind of like your poem has this slow build up, slow until we get to like Mary the Cloaked Mother, or a candle mid collapse, and then you like speed it up from Moral Head. I stomp the pulp for caps.
Yeah.
And then you just kind of like. And it's just so interesting, because then you have like this idea of the seasons going around and like what that means. And then the marigolds, and then you bring up Mary later. Like I just thought that was also an interesting thing, because marigolds are a flower, of course they're gold. and they lean their heads and the seeds fall out. Um, and then a couple lines later, we have Mary, like not Mary Golds, but Mary, like Mother Mary, or the cloak mother. And it's just interesting. Like, was that thought out? Did you choose that flower to reflect Mary later?
After the fact.
After the fact.
After the fact.
So,
yeah.
Okay.
So I remember that sort of cloaked image, a sort of silhouette on my basement walls, right? The cellar walls of my folks' house. And then in revision, I was like, oh yeah, I want to sort of anticipate or forecast a little bit. So after the fact.
That's what I thought later on after like thinking about the poem a little bit. I was like, is that what we're doing? Did he forecast that he was going to bring this up? Like, the whole poem seems to be interconnected at different sections and parts. Like, did you work on that through revision, or was a lot of that luck? Like, what would you, like, give credit for that?
Yeah. I think luck. I think working hard, following the sound.
Following the
sounds, following the sounds, and also sort of like echo images, right? Like opening with the bloating mushrooms, closing with the sort of destruction of them, right? Like stomping them down. It feels like a nice way to sort of bookend, offers that closure, that rhyme offers the closure.
Yeah.
And then from there, I was just a matter of like in the revision process, thinking about finding these little pairings and having a little fun with it, right? And I think that, I've gotten more comfortable with that over time, right? So thinking of the earlier poems in Superstition Review, less sure of that process, maybe?
Right. Kind of like just letting it go, following the poem instead of having that set, like, this is where I want my poem to go.
Right.
It's just like, I'm going to start this poem, and I'm going to let it go, instead of me, like, trying to force it and maneuver it kind of idea.
Right.
Which I feel is something that a lot of poets do get caught up in, is they feel like their poem has to be, like, if you're going to do, like, if you want to do a sonnet, it has to be Shakespearean. But, like, no, like, let yourself loose.
Right.
Let the poem write itself. And then through revision, like, we have, that's what thesauruses are for.
Yeah.
Like, you can sit there and do what you want with it. And that's why I really like this poem, because it kind of encompasses a lot of the stuff that you taught us.
Yeah.
When I took your poetry class last semester.
Yeah.
Because you, as you're saying, like, you just let the poem go, which, as you saw, like, we all struggled with, is we couldn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
We all got it was very rigid at first. We thought, like, I remember my first poem, it was like, rhyme, and then that was like, and then finally I was like, I don't need that.
Right.
And it just kind of, it's like freeing in a way. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what you're describing with this poem.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think the trusting the process, like this this poem was started in maybe 2014, right?
And when was it published?
Last month, right?
Wow.
So it sat on the shelf, like drafted it, and like I wrote it in the morning, and then I just sort of like put it aside, and it was in like this file of just a bunch of drafts.
Okay.
And periodically I'd look at it. Maybe a year and a half later, I sat down with it again, and it kind of came together. I'd have to go back. Maybe I'll do that. I'll send you the files.
Okay.
I'll send you all the steps.
That would be really interesting.
Yeah, that might, we can kind of timestamp it and see where it was and all the different processes, and all the revisions it went through. Yeah.
So why would you, another thing, like, so this poem was put on the shelf for a very long time. So given that time lapse, like, if you could, like, tell, like, aspiring poets,
sure,
like, how do you know when it's done? Not, like, specifically this poem,
or a
but, like,
poem.
just, like, a poem you're writing.
Yeah.
Is it like a feeling? Is Is it just like a Is it bringing it to somebody else and them saying, "Oh,
Yeah.
that's good"?
Yeah.
Or like, is there a process to knowing when a poem should be finished, or is it just you have to go with your gut?
So when I look at poems from my first book, and I think like, oh, these are done, right? Like they're done because they're in a book. But then I read them, and maybe I read them somewhere, and I even as I'm reading, I'm like, oh, right, like I feel maybe apprehension about some of them. So I don't know that they're ever done. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to answer that because I feel like it's one of those questions that like, yeah, it's kind of my feel, right? It's a gut.
Right, yeah.
You know, you sort of send it out into the world.
Well, like, so with your first book that you have published, and you said you go back and you read it and you're like, it's not finished. Do you think that's because maybe, like, your style or your process has changed? And so you want to fit those poems to more so what you're writing now than what you were, or the mindset you're in now than you were then kind of idea?
Yeah.
Like, do you think that all has an effect on, like, poems and or like a poem like this, like you said, you shelved it, and then one day you just brought it back, and now look at it, it's been published.
Right. Yeah, I think. I mean, I guess I change, right?
Right.
I change my attitude about what I want a poem to do, or I see places like these doorways that I didn't take with the poem.
Okay.
Right. These sort of like openings where it's like, oh, this image actually feels like it wants to go this other way or whatever.
Okay.
But I don't know that makes that poem maybe it doesn't make it incomplete.
Right.
It just has these like sort of little spirals coming off it or something
that you could potentially make a new poem.
Right.
So on and so forth.
Yeah.
So back to this one. If you could like do like a takeaway for your readers, what would you want them to be? Or like for somebody reading it, what would you say? Like, does this just enjoyment? Like,
yeah, I think so.
Just enjoyment, like just
quietude, a sort of
Because like this made me think, like, because like I was saying, like when I got down to the cellar walls, I used to live in Rhode Island, and it made me think of that. So it also took me through this like. Yeah, I was reading your poem, but yet I was like reflecting back on like, oh, I remember those cellar walls in Rhode Island. Oh, I remember like when I first heard dew point and not knowing what it meant.
Right.
I didn't come up with like definitions like that for it, but you know,
Sure.
or we've all. Well, I don't know if I can't say that for everyone, but I know a lot of people have definitely stomped on a mushroom cap. You know, because it's fun sometimes just to.
It's kind of satisfying.
It's so satisfying. Oh, you're gonna grow in my yard?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
It's so that's like an interesting thing, especially when we have the authors come, because it's just like when you're writing, like, do you have to like for like a time to tear and a time to mend? Did you ever like think this one was gonna be published? Did you want it to be published?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have sent it out.
I mean,
right? But yeah, no, that's a good question. Like how I sent it out. I believe in it. I try not to send out stuff I don't believe in. Right? Like so just to round out a manuscript or something.
Right.
Yeah. I try not to do that. I don't know. I don't know what I would want though. Like in terms of like what do I want a reader to sort of take away? I guess kind of whatever they want.
Kind of. I mean, which is what poetry does, because it's up to them, to their perception of it. What they
you
take
sort of finish it, right? I mean, like you were saying, like if the images are working well, if they're evocative, if the language is compressed or somehow memorable, you're gonna, as a reader, you're gonna sort of, like it resonates, right? It has a little echo. But also memory has an echo, right?
Right. Yes, memory does. I love that actually. Memory does have an echo, and I can definitely see that echoing. But see, like with your poem, it's like you know, have you ever like yelled like on a pond that had like cliffs and stuff,
Yeah,
and
a
the
quarry.
echo like, yeah, a quarry, and like the echo bounces back and forth, but then it all like stops and centralizes.
Yeah,
That's how I felt about your poem, but it never felt like it was going like wild.
Yeah.
It like because you kept centering us back. Like that's how I felt. Like we had this across the lawn, the fungi bloat, the gray wish days have come. You know, something wreck it. Like you know, you brought me back in, and then we start going back out to this bench, and then um, lapse with the seasons already into sadness and apathy, marigolds.
Yeah.
Like just the way that you just did that, it was just like you kept giving us these images that worked together, but it was kind of like we're echoing through past and present and like thinking about how time is changing and how a bench goes from one thing to another over time. Or the marigold, how what it looked like during the summer, all up and beautiful, and now she's like, "Aw," you know. And then we get to the dribbles of the arc lamp, the fog, like it was all just so like it was like I kept bouncing like through these images, not in like a bad way. It was like more like it was fun. And then like, but you would always center us back with like marigolds, declaim it, a femoral head. I stopped to pulp the caps. Like every image that you brought up always had that connective tissue to bring up the next image. But then if you look at it as a whole, all the images got connected. If you think of that, memory, like thinking about memory and then going back, and then just like we talked about a little bit earlier, starting with the fungi bloat, and then I stomped both the caps. Like we have these two things here, and all these really awesome things going on, and they all get connected to make a really good poem. Which is why I thought it was so awesome. Because in a short amount of time, you brought me through so many things to where it wasn't, but I didn't get that, like, I'm lost feeling at all.
Sure.
Because you just had some statement that just, like, grounded you and then sent you to the next one. And then you brought me, like, full circle. Like, as a reader of it, like, that's how it felt. And it was really awesome.
Yeah.
So.
Thanks, Mason.
No problem.
Thank you very much. That's really nice. Well, thank you. Thank you. All right, well, good. Mason Yarborough, everybody, interviewer and poet extraordinaire, and thank you all very much.
And Dr. Adam Houle.